The number most retirement calculators don't show you isn't your projected balance at 65. It's the compounding gap, the difference between what $500,000 does when it's structured correctly versus when it's treated like a savings account with a countdown timer on it. That gap, over 25 years of actual retirement spending, is the difference between arriving at 85 with $2 million and arriving at 85 with a second mortgage and an awkward conversation with your daughter about the spare bedroom. And the formula that produces the $2 million outcome isn't secret. It's not locked behind a hedge fund. It's barely even complicated. It's just almost never explained correctly. And today, I'm fixing that. Here's the standard retirement story. You save for 30 or 40 years. You hit 65. You retire. You start withdrawing 4% a year. You pray the market doesn't do anything interesting. And somewhere around year 22, you start doing the terrifying math again, checking whether the account will outlast you. That's the plan most Americans execute on. It's a survival strategy, and some people survive it. But there's a different plan, a structural plan, that a smaller group of retirees quietly run. Same starting balance, same market conditions, completely different ending. I want to show you exactly why those outcomes diverge, because the reason isn't what most people assume. The idea I'm going to use throughout this entire video is an orchard. Stick with me. You inherit an orchard, 50 acres of apple trees. You can do one of two things. Option 1, you start chopping down trees and selling the wood. Immediate cash, you're eating today. But every tree you cut is a tree that can't produce fruit next season, or the season after, or the season after that. 30 years later, you've got a flat field, a lot of old stumps, and nothing left to show for what your parents built. Option 2, you pick the fruit every year from a portion of the trees. You let the rest of the orchard keep growing. The older trees get larger, produce more. You reinvest some of the harvest, plant new seedlings. After 30 years, your 50 acres is 120 acres, and you've been eating apples the whole time. Most retirees are cutting down trees. The ones who turn 500,000 into 2 million are picking fruit and letting the orchard expand. Every time I reference the orchard today, the point is the same. Don't cut down the trees. That's the whole game. Now I want to tell you about two brothers-in-law. Call them Frank and Gary. They retire the same year, same city, nearly identical portfolios, both sitting on roughly $500,000. Same era, same market. 20 years later, one of them has crossed $2 million. The other is seriously considering whether to sell the house. I'm not going to tell you yet which one is which. Keep that question in the back of your head, because the answer is going to flip your instinct about who made the smarter moves. But first, I need to show you the thing that actually kills retirement portfolios. And it's not what you think. Most people believe the biggest threat to a retirement portfolio is a major market crash. 2008, 2020. The dramatic drops. But here's the counterintuitive truth. Market crashes don't destroy retirement portfolios by themselves. What destroys them is where in your retirement timeline the crash lands. This concept has a name: sequence of returns risk. And it might be the most important idea in retirement finance that most people have never encountered. Here's how it works mechanically. Two people retire with the same $500,000. They both average the exact same 7% annual return over 20 years. Identical averages, different sequences. Person A gets hammered in years 1 through 5, then enjoys strong returns later. Person B gets the strong returns first and absorbs the bad years later. Same average, same portfolio. One person ends up broke, the other ends up fine. Why? Because when you're withdrawing money in year 2 of a down market, you're selling shares at their lowest value. You lock in those losses. You permanently reduce your share count. And when the market eventually recovers, and it does, you have fewer shares to participate in the rebound. The portfolio never fully catches up. It's a mechanical trap, not a bad luck story. Person B, meanwhile, built a cushion in the good early years. By the time the crash hit, the account had grown enough to absorb the shock without forcing catastrophic sell-offs at the bottom. So you think the market is the problem. The market is not the problem. The sequence is the problem. And the implication of that is brutal and specific. If you retired in 2007, and millions of Americans did, you were person A. The 2008 collapse didn't hurt your portfolio the way it hurt a 30-year-old with decades left to recover. It permanently altered your retirement trajectory. Sequence risk isn't a theoretical concern. It's a documented reality that happened to real people who planned responsibly and still got destroyed. Not because they were careless, but because the calendar worked against them. This is exactly why the orchard metaphor holds. The farmer who's been picking fruit and storing it in the barn doesn't need to cut down trees when a frost hits. He survives the bad season without permanently damaging what grows. The farmer cutting down trees every single month has no buffer. He cuts during the frost. That tree never grows back. And every subsequent year, the orchard is just a little bit smaller. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you the exact structure that breaks sequence risk. The same three-part system the retirees who double and then some their starting portfolio quietly use. But first, I need to show you how badly the conventional wisdom sets you up for the wrong problem. The 4% rule. The idea that you can safely withdraw 4% of your portfolio annually for 30 years was developed in 1994 by a financial planner named William Bengen. It was a reasonable heuristic based on historical data available at the time. What most people don't know is that Bengen himself later revised it, saying the actual safe rate was closer to 4.5% with better asset allocation. And multiple studies since have found it breaks down significantly in prolonged low-return environments, which is, by the way, a pretty good description of what many economists are projecting for the next decade as of early 2026, between elevated valuations and slower nominal growth. So the rule that most people's retirement plans are built around was created 30 years ago, revised by its own creator, and has since been stress-tested against exactly the market conditions it wasn't designed for. And financial advisors keep recommending it because it's easy to explain, and it protects them from liability claims. Amused disappointment. That's genuinely all I have. And look, even if the 4% rule holds perfectly, it is a survival strategy, not a growth strategy. You survive. You don't expand. You make it to the end without running out. If markets cooperate, if inflation doesn't spike for a decade, if your healthcare costs don't exceed projections, if you live exactly as long as the actuarial tables predict. That's a lot of conditional clauses stacked on top of a 30-year horizon. The retirees who turn 500,000 into 2 million are not running a survival strategy. They are running a growth strategy with a defense layer built into it. And that's the structure I want to walk you through now. I call it the 3-orchard system. 3 buckets, 3 time horizons, 1 governing rule. Keep the orchard growing while you harvest the fruit. Orchard 1 is the harvest pile. Cash, money market funds, short-term treasury bills, maybe a short-duration CD ladder. The rule for this bucket is simple and non-negotiable. It holds 3 to 5 years of living expenses. If you spend $40,000 a year, this bucket holds between $120,000 and $200,000. That's it. This is the fruit already in the barn. When the market crashes, and it will, you do not sell a single share. You live off what you already picked. Sequence risk neutralized. Not mitigated, neutralized. Because you never have to sell during the down years. You wait. You let the other orchards recover. Orchard 2 is the fruit trees. Income-generating investments, dividend-paying blue-chip stocks, real estate investment trusts, maybe some investment-grade corporate bonds. This bucket doesn't need to grow aggressively. Its job is to produce steady, reliable income. Call it 3 to 5% annually in dividends and distributions. On $150,000, that's between $4,500 and $7,500 flowing in every year. Some of that income flows into Orchard 1 when it gets low. Some gets redirected into Orchard 3. The fruit trees are the engine that keeps the whole system self-sustaining. Orchard 3 is the growth forest. Broad market index funds, total market ETFs, the boring, completely unsexy stuff that compounds year after year without you doing anything. This is money you do not touch for 10 years minimum. On a $500,000 starting portfolio, you might commit $250,000 here. At 8% average annual growth, and the long-run S&P 500 average net of typical fees sits just below 10%, so 8% is conservative. That $250,000 becomes $540,000 in 10 years. You doubled it, without touching it once, while you were living your life. Now watch the math run in real time. You are living off Orchard 1 for the first 5 years, no market withdrawals, 0. Orchard 3 has 5 completely uninterrupted years of compounding. At 8% annually, that $250,000 becomes $367,000 in 5 years. You then refill Orchard 1. You move $100,000 from that growth back into your cash pile. You still have $267,000 left in Orchard 3, more than you started with. While you spend $100,000 of real money on real life. That is not a typo. You spent $100,000, and your growth bucket is larger than when you began. The orchard is expanding. By year 10, you've refilled Orchard 1 twice. You've spent $200,000 in total, and your combined portfolio, all 3 buckets, is sitting somewhere around $680,000 to $700,000. You started at $500,000. You spent $200,000. You have $680,000. That is the compounding gap in action. By the way, hit subscribe if this is landing for you, because YouTube's algorithm is genuinely erratic and may never service my videos again if you don't signal interest. I read the boring documents, SEC filings, earnings reports, tax code amendments, so you don't have to. It would be a shame for the algorithm to bury that. Now, here's the reversal I want you to sit with, because this is where the frame completely flips. You think the problem is not having saved enough money. That's the wrong problem. The problem is the order in which you spend it and the structure you use to hold it. I've watched people with $700,000 crater their retirement in under a decade because they had no structure. And I've seen people with $400,000 compound past $1 million because they ran the orchard system from day one. The amount you start with matters less than what you do with it during the first 5 years. And here's the psychological dimension that nobody talks about, but which I think is actually where the real alpha lives. When your retirement is one big account, one number on one screen you check every day, your brain cannot separate spending from loss. Every withdrawal feels like the portfolio contracting. Every market dip feels like your future dissolving. The stress response is real, and it is costly. People make genuinely terrible decisions when their nervous system is running on sustained anxiety. And retirement is exactly the kind of prolonged, open-ended pressure that keeps that anxiety active. The bucket system works partly because of math. It also works because of architecture. When Orchard 1 is a separate account and you see that number decline over time, your brain understands that's expected. It's doing its job. Orchard 3 is somewhere else. Its volatility doesn't feel like your grocery bill at risk. The growth and the spending become 2 psychologically distinct things. The panic response quiets down, and that psychological unlock, conservatively, is probably worth $200,000 to $300,000 over 30 years in avoided panic decisions alone. In 2008, individual investors pulled hundreds of billions of dollars out of equity funds near the absolute bottom of the crash. Then they watched the market recover everything within 3 years from a position of cash, having locked in catastrophic permanent losses. That wasn't stupidity. That was a structural failure. They had no barn full of fruit. They were cutting down trees in a blizzard. Don't cut down the trees, especially during the frost. That's when it costs the most. Now I want to talk about something most retirement conversations skip entirely because it requires people to challenge a decision that feels emotionally settled. Housing. By the time most people retire at 65, their house is paid off, or close to it, and the conventional wisdom says, stay. You own it. It's familiar. The neighbors know your name. Your doctor is 10 minutes away. But here's what the conventional wisdom never actually calculates. A paid-off house in a decent market is still costing you $12,000 to $20,000 a year in property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and utilities. On a house worth $400,000, that's a 3 to 5% annual carrying cost on an asset that isn't generating income. And that asset is tying up $400,000 in equity that is doing absolutely nothing for you financially. Now compare that to selling the house, downsizing to something smaller, or renting, and freeing up $250,000 to redirect into Orchard 3. At 8% annual growth, $250,000 generates $20,000 a year in portfolio appreciation, more than enough to cover rent in most mid-cost cities. And you've shifted from a static, depreciating expense to a growing, compounding asset. I know that feels uncomfortable. It violates something deep in the American homeowner psychology. But discomfort is not the same as incorrectness. The math is the math. There's a story about a retired engineer named Harold who refused to sell his house in Phoenix when he retired. Paid off, beautiful place, emotional attachment going back 30 years. His financial advisor ran the numbers twice and told him the equity could generate more in the market than the house cost to maintain. Harold said no. 10 years later, Harold's neighbor, similar house, similar neighborhood, had sold, moved to a 2-bedroom rental nearby, invested the difference, and was sitting on an additional $400,000 in portfolio growth. Harold had a nicer garage. Harold also had almost no flexibility left when his wife had a medical emergency in year 12, and they needed liquidity fast. He sold the house under pressure, in a rush, in a down real estate market, and didn't get close to what his neighbor got. The orchard Harold wouldn't sell had already stopped growing. He just hadn't checked. This is where Frank and Gary come back into the picture. Remember them? 2 brothers-in-law, same starting amount, same market, 20-year gap in outcomes. Here's what actually happened. Frank was cautious. He kept 60% of his portfolio in bonds because his advisor told him to de-risk at 65. He kept the big family house because selling felt like giving up. He withdrew 4% a year, straight from his brokerage account without any bucket separation. When the market dropped in year 3, his account dropped and he withdrew anyway. Because bills don't care about the S&P 500, he cut down trees during the frost. The orchard got smaller. And when year 7 came and the market had recovered beautifully, Frank had so few shares left that the recovery didn't reach him the way it should have. Gary ran the 3 orchard system from month 1. He right-sized his housing situation in year 2, downsized, freed up equity, added it to Orchard 3. He kept 60% of his portfolio in equities because he understood that at 65, with potentially 30 more years of life expectancy, aggressive growth assets are not reckless, they're necessary. He never touched Orchard 3 during the bad years. He lived off the harvest pile. He waited. The orchard expanded. 20 years later, Gary has $2.1 million. Frank has $163,000 and a house he's debating whether to sell. Same starting amount, different operating system. Here's a concrete walkthrough with specific numbers because I don't want this to feel abstract. Meet Sandra. She's 63 years old. She retires with exactly $500,000 in investable assets. No pension, modest Social Security coming at 67 of around $18,000 per year. She follows the 3 orchard system. She allocates $100,000 to Orchard 1, her cash pile, covering about 2.5 years of spending at $40,000 per year. She puts $150,000 into Orchard 2, dividend stocks, generating roughly 4% annually, or $6,000 per year. She puts $250,000 into Orchard 3, broad market index funds with a 10-year, no-touch rule, year 1 through year 2. Sandra lives on Orchard 1. The market does something weird, drops 18% in year 1. She doesn't care. She's eating the fruit she already picked. Orchard 2 keeps producing dividends. Some of that income flows into Orchard 1 to extend its runway. Orchard 3 drops to $205,000 on paper. Sandra doesn't look at it more than once a month, and she doesn't panic because the number doesn't affect her daily life. Year 3. Market recovers. Orchard 3 is back to $255,000. Orchard 2 has been quietly reinvesting some dividends and is now worth $160,000. Year 5. Sandra's Orchard 1 is getting low, about $60,000 left. But Orchard 3 is now $367,000. She moves $100,000 from Orchard 3 back to Orchard 1. Orchard 3 still has $267,000. Her total portfolio? Roughly $487,000. After spending $100,000 in real withdrawals, she's barely below where she started. Year 8. Social Security kicks in at 67, adding $18,000 per year to her income. She reduces her Orchard 1 withdrawals to $22,000 annually. The pressure on the system drops. Orchard 3 continues compounding undisturbed. Year 12. Orchard 3 has reached $540,000. Sandra's total portfolio, all three buckets, is over $700,000. She has spent roughly $360,000 in total over 12 years. She has more money than she started with. Year 25. Sandra is 88 years old. She has spent close to $700,000 over the course of her retirement. Her total portfolio value is $1.4 million. She has outlasted both her spending and most of her neighbors' portfolios. The orchard outgrew the harvest. Now here's the part where most people make the critical error, and I want to address it directly because I've seen it happen repeatedly. The first 5 years of retirement are the most financially dangerous years of your life, not because of market risk, because of you. You finally have time. You finally have the money sitting there. The kids throw you a retirement party. Your spouse starts making lists. The RV brochure appears on the kitchen counter. And suddenly, in year 1 and 2, instead of withdrawing $40,000 as planned, you've withdrawn $140,000. The bucket trip, the RV, the kitchen renovation you'd been putting off, the generous gift to help your kid with a down payment. The brochure said invest in experiences. I thought that was financial advice. That $200,000 of unplanned first 5-year withdrawals doesn't cost you $200,000. At 8% compounding over 25 years, each of those dollars would have become $6.80. You didn't spend $200,000. You spent $1,360,000 in future portfolio value. The orchard you cut down in year 2 would have fed your grandchildren. This is loss framing, and I'm using it deliberately because it's the only math that actually changes behavior. Most people will spend an extra $100,000 in retirement without blinking. Almost nobody would agree to spend the equivalent of $680,000 in future money, but that's what it is. Every dollar you withdraw in year 1 is not $1. It is what that dollar becomes at 8% over however many years are left. The wealthy retirees don't treat year 1 of retirement as permission. They treat it as the most important financial year of their lives, because structurally, it is. Now there's one more layer here that I want to give you, because this is where the strategy becomes genuinely counterintuitive and where most financial advisors will actually push back on you. Conventional retirement advice says, de-risk as you age, shift toward bonds, reduce equity exposure, go from 90% stocks to 60% to 40% over the course of your retirement. The logic is that you can't afford volatility when you're living off the portfolio. But that logic is built on the assumption that you're exposed to your portfolio's volatility every single month, that any drop translates directly into a cut in your living standard. And if you have no bucket system, that's true. You are exposed. Every drop does hit you. But run the 3 orchard system and the logic inverts. Your orchard 1 is not in stocks. It's not volatile. You're fine for 3 to 5 years, regardless of what the market does. Which means orchard 3, your growth engine, can stay aggressive. Not reckless, but aggressive. 60% equities is almost certainly too conservative for a 65-year-old with a 30-year time horizon and a properly structured 3-bucket system. Orchard 3 can handle being 80 or 90% equities because you're not touching it for a decade. The conventional advice to de-risk was written for a world without the bucket structure. Apply the bucket structure, and you've essentially bought yourself a decade of protection from your own nervous system, which means Orchard 3 can do what it's built to do. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because I mean it literally. The retirees who read the headlines, chased the meme stocks, rotated in and out of sectors, tried to time the market, held crypto as a meaningful portfolio position. Most of them are underperforming the person who put $250,000 into a total market index fund in 2010 and didn't touch it for 15 years. That person's money grew 11-fold. The active trader, on average, underperformed the index by 1 to 3% per year, which over 15 years is the difference between $1 million and $2.3 million. The system beats the hustle. The orchard beats the chainsaw. So here are 3 specific, non-generic takeaways, not diversify your portfolio noise, actual mechanics from this conversation. First, calculate your sequence risk exposure right now, before you retire. Run 2 scenarios, one where the market drops 30% in your first 3 years, one where it drops 30% in your final 3 years. If the outcomes are dramatically different, you have unprotected sequence risk. Fix that before you touch the retirement date. Second, build Orchard 1 first. Before you invest another dollar in anything else, establish 3 years of living expenses in a high-yield savings account or short-term treasury ladder. This is not dead money. This is the psychological infrastructure that will prevent you from making a $50,000 panic decision during the next market crash. And that decision would cost you $340,000 at 8% over 25 years. Third, audit every major asset for its role in the system. Your house is not automatically Orchard 3. Your rental property is not automatically Orchard 2. Map every asset to a function: harvest pile, income generator, or growth engine. And if an asset doesn't have a clear function, it's costing you compounding you'll never get back. Oh, and Frank? He finally sold the house last year. He got less than he would have 10 years ago after adjustment for inflation and the rush timeline. Gary was at his closing, politely not saying anything. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. The orchard doesn't need you to be brilliant. It needs you to not cut down the trees.